Richard's mansion was the jewel of the neighborhood, a sprawling estate with manicured lawns, sparkling fountains, and grand chandeliers that dazzled anyone who stepped inside. Yet, despite its beauty, it stood in stark contrast to the warmth and camaraderie that had begun to spread throughout the rest of the community. While Richard hosted lavish parties for his wealthy friends, the people living in James's renovated homes were forming bonds over shared meals, laughter, and mutual support. The difference between the two worlds couldn't have been more obvious. James, on the other hand, lived simply. He chose to stay in one of the smaller properties he owned, a cozy house with just enough space for him and his dog, Max. Every morning he would walk through the neighborhood, greeting tenants by name and asking if they needed anything. His presence brought comfort to those who had once felt invisible. Families struggling to pay bills found relief in James's affordable rents while children played freely in the communal garden he had helped create. Slowly but surely, James was building something far more valuable than wealth. He was creating a sense of belonging. Word of James's generosity reached even the ears of those outside the neighborhood. Local newspapers began writing about the veteran landlord who prioritized humanity over profit. Strangers started visiting, curious to see this remarkable transformation for themselves. Some came seeking advice on how to replicate James's model in their own communities, while others simply wanted to thank him for inspiring hope. James welcomed them all with open arms, sharing stories of his time in the military and the lessons he'd learned about teamwork, sacrifice, and resilience. But not everyone was pleased with James's growing influence. Richard Caldwell watched, from afar, seething with frustration. He couldn't understand why people admired James so much. To Richard, success was measured in dollars and possessions, not in smiles or handshakes. He saw James's actions as a direct threat to his authority and decided to fight back. Determined to tarnish James's reputation, Richard began spreading rumors. He told anyone who would listen that James must have obtained the properties illegally or used underhanded tactics to win people over. At first, some residents listened to Richard's whispers. After all, he was a well-known figure in the area, and his wealth gave him an air of credibility. But as days turned into weeks, the truth became impossible to ignore. James's tenants spoke up, defending him passionately. They shared stories of how he had helped them during tough times, repairing leaky roofs without charging extra, offering payment plans when jobs were lost, and even organizing fundraisers for medical emergencies. These testimonials painted a picture of a man who genuinely cared, leaving no room for Richard's lies to take root. Frustrated by his failure to turn people against James, Richard tried a new tactic. He approached James directly, pretending to be friendly. Over coffee at a nearby cafe, Richard complimented James on his business acumen and suggested they collaborate. "We could make a fortune," Richard said with a sly grin. "You've got the properties and I've got the connections. Together we could dominate this entire area." James listened patiently, his expression unreadable. When Richard finished speaking, James leaned forward and replied softly but firmly, "My goal isn't to dominate, it's to serve." Richard scoffed, unable to grasp the concept. "Serve? What do you get out of serving others? There's no glory in that." James smiled gently, his eyes reflecting years of wisdom. "The reward is knowing I've made a difference. That's worth more than any amount of money." With that, the conversation ended. Richard stormed off, angrier than ever, while James returned home, content in his decision. Despite Richard's attempts to undermine him, James continued strengthening the community. He organized weekend barbecues where neighbors could mingle and introduced monthly movie nights in the park. Children loved these events, running around with sparklers after sunset while parents relaxed on picnic blankets. Even the elderly joined, in sharing stories of their youth and teaching younger generations games they used to play. Laughter echoed through the streets, replacing the tension that had once lingered due to Richard's arrogance. As the neighborhood thrived, Richard grew, increasingly isolated. His mansion, though magnificent, felt cold and empty. Guests stopped coming, deterred by his sour attitude and constant complaints about James. Servants quit, tired of his unreasonable demands. Even his closest business associates avoided him, sensing that his downfall was inevitable. For the first time in his life, Richard experienced true loneliness, a hollow ache that no amount of money could fill. Desperate to reclaim his status, Richard devised one final plan. He announced a grand gala at his mansion, inviting everyone in the neighborhood. It'll remind them of the old days, he thought smugly. They'll see what real luxury looks like. Invitations were sent out, each one embossed with gold lettering and boasting promises of fine dining and live entertainment. But when the day of the gala arrived, only a handful of people showed up, and most of them left early, uncomfortable with the opulence and Richard's thinly veiled disdain for their simpler lives. Standing alone in his glittering ballroom, surrounded by untouched hors d'oeuvres and silent musicians, Richard realized the depth of his failure. Money hadn't bought him happiness or respect. Instead, it had built walls between him and the very people he claimed to lead. Meanwhile, across the neighborhood, James sat on his porch, watching fireworks light up the night sky as families celebrated another successful community event. The contrast between the two men was striking, one trapped in bitterness, the other embraced by love and gratitude. Though Richard refused to admit it, the neighborhood had changed forever. Where fear and division once ruled, unity and compassion now reigned supreme. And at the center of it all stood James Harper, the humble veteran who had turned ridicule into redemption, not just for himself, but for everyone fortunate enough to call this place home. James Harper sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the letter in his hands. The paper was slightly crumpled from being read and reread countless times, but the words remained clear. He had inherited a small collection of properties from a distant relative. At first, James felt overwhelmed. He had spent years struggling to make ends meet after leaving the military, relying on odd jobs and government assistance to survive. Managing real estate seemed like a task far beyond his capabilities. But as he thought about Richard Caldwell's cruel words during their encounter in the park, something inside him stirred. Richard's sneering face haunted James, the way he had mocked him for being poor despite his service to the country. It wasn't just the insult that bothered James. It was the casual arrogance behind it, the belief that wealth equaled worth. James knew he couldn't change Richard overnight, but perhaps he could prove him wrong, not out of spite, but to show that true value came from helping others. With this newfound determination burning within him, James decided to take action. He began visiting the properties one by one. Most were old and neglected, with peeling paint, broken windows, and overgrown yards. They weren't much to look at, but James saw potential. He rolled up his sleeves and got to work, fixing what he could himself and hiring local workers for bigger repairs. Neighbors passing by would stop to watch, curious about the man who seemed so dedicated to breathing new life into these forgotten buildings. Some offered to help, lending tools or pitching in with manual labor. Slowly, the houses transformed. Fresh coats of paint brightened the exteriors, gardens sprouted where weeds once thrived, and cozy interiors replaced dusty, empty rooms. Word spread quickly about the affordable rents James was offering. Families struggling to find stable housing flocked to the neighborhood, eager to live in safe, welcoming homes. Each tenant received a warm welcome from James, who made sure they understood the rules were simple: respect each other, take care of the property, and treat the community like family. For many residents, this was a rare opportunity, a chance to escape cramped apartments or unreliable landlords and build a better life for themselves and their children. Among the new tenants was Maria Gonzalez, a single mother of two who had been evicted from her previous apartment when the rent skyrocketed. She arrived at James's doorstep, clutching her children's hands, unsure if she'd be accepted. Instead of turning her away, James assured her she'd find stability here. "This is your home now," he told her with a smile. "And we're all here to support each other." Tears welled up in Maria's eyes as she thanked him, vowing to do whatever it took to contribute to the community. As more families moved in, the neighborhood began to feel alive again. Children played outside under the watchful eyes of parents, chatting on porches. Strangers became friends, sharing meals and stories late into the evening. James encouraged everyone to participate in shaping the community. He held meetings where residents could voice concerns or suggest ideas, ensuring no one felt left out. Together, they organized cleanup days, planting trees along sidewalks and painting murals on blank walls. The changes weren't just physical. They brought people closer, fostering trust and cooperation, but not everyone approved of what was happening. Richard Caldwell watched from his mansion, irritated by the sudden influx of activity. His pristine lawn and polished cars seemed out of place among the bustling energy of James's revitalized neighborhood. To Richard, these improvements were an eyesore, disrupting the exclusivity he prized. He muttered complaints to anyone who would listen, dismissing James's efforts as amateurish and unsustainable. Yet, no matter how loudly he complained, the truth was undeniable. James's properties were thriving while Richard's remained untouched, symbols of isolation rather than progress. Determined to assert his dominance, Richard hosted a dinner party for the elite members of society, hoping to remind everyone of his status. Guests admired his marble floors and crystal glasses, but conversations inevitably turned to the neighborhood's transformation. "Have you seen those houses James fixed up?" one guest asked, clearly impressed. "They're charming, aren't they? And the rents are so reasonable." Another chimed in. "I hear he even lets tenants pay in installments if they're having trouble. What a kind man." Richard bristled at the praise directed toward James. How dare they admire someone who didn't even belong in their circle? He tried to steer the conversation back to topics he deemed worthy: investments, luxury vacations, exclusive clubs, but found himself ignored. By the end of the night, his guests were discussing plans to visit James's neighborhood to see it for themselves. Humiliated, Richard retreated to his study, nursing a glass of whiskey and plotting his next move. Meanwhile, James continued his mission undeterred. He noticed that many residents struggled with basic necessities, especially during tough economic times. Inspired by the camaraderie growing around him, he established a small fund using part of the rental income. This fund provided emergency assistance for medical bills, groceries, or school supplies. He also reached out to local businesses, asking for donations or discounts for his tenants. Surprisingly, many agreed, touched by James's genuine desire to help. The impact of James's efforts rippled through the neighborhood. A young boy named Tommy, whose father had lost his job, proudly showed off a backpack filled with fresh notebooks and pencils donated through the fund. An elderly woman named Mrs. Thompson, who had been unable to afford her medication, tearfully hugged James after receiving financial aid. These moments fueled James's resolve, reminding him why he had started this journey in the first place. Yet, even as the community flourished, James remained humble. He refused to take credit for its success, insisting it was a collective effort. "We're all in this together," he often said. "I'm just glad I can play a small part." His sincerity resonated deeply with those around him, earning him not only their gratitude but also their loyalty. In contrast, Richard's bitterness grew, isolating him further from the very world he sought to control. Unbeknownst to either man, fate was about to intervene in ways neither could predict. As the weeks passed, cracks began to form in Richard's carefully constructed facade, threatening to shatter the illusion of invincibility he had worked so hard to maintain. And James, though unaware of the challenges ahead, stood ready to face them with the same courage and compassion that had guided him thus far. As the weeks went by, James Harper's influence in the neighborhood grew stronger. People began to see him not just as a landlord but as a friend, a mentor, and even a hero. His presence brought a sense of security and hope that had been missing for years. Every morning he walked through the streets, checking on his tenants and making sure everything was running smoothly. If someone needed help moving furniture, James was there. If a child scraped their knee while playing outside, James would rush over with a bandage and a kind word. He didn't do these things because he expected anything in return. He did them because it was simply who he was. One day, James decided to organize a community garden in an empty lot near the center of the neighborhood. The space had been neglected for years, overrun with weeds and trash. But James saw potential where others saw only decay. He gathered volunteers from among the residents, young and old, and together they cleared the land, planted seeds, and built raised beds. Within weeks, the once barren lot transformed into a vibrant patchwork of greenery. Tomatoes, peppers, lettuce, and herbs sprouted under the care of eager hands. The garden became a hub of activity, with families working side by side, sharing tips on gardening and swapping stories about their lives. The communal spirit spread beyond the garden. Neighbors started organizing events, cookouts, movie nights, and holiday celebrations that brought everyone closer together. Children laughed as they chased each other around, while adults exchanged recipes and shared meals made from the fresh produce grown in the garden. Even those who had initially kept to themselves began joining in, drawn by the warmth and inclusivity of the community James had nurtured. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like a true home. Richard Caldwell, however, couldn't stand what he was witnessing. From the windows of his mansion, he watched as people gathered in the park or worked happily in the garden. Their laughter grated on his nerves, a constant reminder of how irrelevant he had become. What infuriated him most was the way people looked at James, with admiration, gratitude, and respect. Richard had always believed that wealth commanded loyalty, yet here was a man with nothing proving him wrong every single day. Determined to reclaim his position as the neighborhood's most important figure, Richard launched a smear campaign against James. He began spreading rumors, whispering to anyone who would listen that James must have obtained the properties illegally. "How else could a poor veteran afford all this?" he sneered during one conversation with a neighbor. "He probably cut corners or took advantage of some loophole." At first, a few people listened, curious about the source of James's sudden success. But when they asked James directly, he answered honestly, explaining the inheritance and his decision to use it for the good of others. His transparency silenced any doubts. Still, Richard refused to give up. He approached local authorities, filing anonymous complaints about noise violations and zoning issues related to the community garden. Inspectors arrived, clipboard in hand, ready to shut down the project. But when they arrived, they found something unexpected, a thriving, well-maintained space that brought joy to dozens of families. Instead of issuing fines, the inspectors praised the initiative and encouraged its continuation. One inspector even joked, "If every neighborhood had a garden like this, we'd have fewer problems to deal with." Frustrated by his failure to discredit James, Richard tried a different approach. He attempted to buy some of the properties from James, offering sums far above their market value. "Think about it," he said during one meeting at a nearby cafe. "With my connections, we could turn this place into something truly extraordinary. Luxury condos, high-end shops, we'd make millions." James listened patiently, his expression calm but firm. When Richard finished speaking, James shook his head. "This neighborhood isn't about luxury or profit," he replied. "It's about giving people a chance to live with dignity and support each other. That's worth more than any amount of money." Richard stormed out of the cafe, fuming. He couldn't understand why anyone would turn down such an offer. To him, wealth was the ultimate measure of success, a sign of power and importance. But James valued something entirely different: compassion, connection, and the ability to make a difference in people's lives. This fundamental difference between them only deepened Richard's resentment. Despite Richard's relentless efforts to undermine him, James continued building the community. He introduced programs to teach children life skills, organizing workshops on cooking, carpentry, and even basic financial literacy. Adults benefited too, attending classes on resume writing and job interview preparation. These initiatives not only empowered individuals, but also strengthened the bonds within the neighborhood. People who had once felt invisible now had opportunities to grow and thrive. Meanwhile, Richard's own world began to crumble. His extravagant lifestyle, funded by risky investments, left him vulnerable to economic shifts. When the stock market took a sudden downturn, Richard's businesses suffered massive losses. Creditors called daily, demanding payment, and his once loyal employees abandoned him, seeking stable jobs elsewhere. For the first time in his life, Richard faced the very struggles he had mocked in others. Humiliated and desperate, Richard sold off assets to keep his empire afloat. Yet no matter how much he sacrificed, it wasn't enough. Eventually, he was forced to put his mansion on the market. News of the sale spread quickly, and soon everyone knew that Richard Caldwell, the man who had ruled the neighborhood with arrogance and disdain, was losing everything. When James heard about the mansion being up for sale, he saw an opportunity. He contacted Richard, proposing to buy the property. At first, Richard refused, unwilling to let James claim another victory, but as creditors closed in and the pressure mounted, he had no choice but to accept. The day of the sale arrived, and James met Richard at the mansion, standing quietly as the papers were signed. There was no gloating, no triumph in James's demeanor, only quiet resolve. After the transaction was complete, James revealed his plan for the mansion. "I'm turning it into a community center," he explained, "a place where veterans, low-income families, and anyone in need can find resources and support." Richard stared at him, stunned. For the first time, he realized the depth of James's character and the shallowness of his own. As James walked away, Richard sank into a chair, overwhelmed by shame and regret. Though Richard faded from the neighborhood, his downfall marked the beginning of a new chapter. Under James's leadership, the community center became a beacon of hope, offering free meals, job training, and counseling services. Families who had once struggled to survive now flourished, united by a shared purpose. And at the heart of it all stood James Harper, the humble veteran who had turned ridicule into redemption, not just for himself but for everyone fortunate enough to call this place home. The transformation of Richard Caldwell's mansion into a community center was nothing short of remarkable. James Harper wasted no time in getting to work. He hired local contractors, many of whom were tenants or neighbors, to help renovate the sprawling estate. Walls that had once been adorned with expensive artwork were repainted in soft, welcoming colors. Crystal chandeliers were replaced with practical yet warm lighting. The grand ballroom, where Richard had hosted his exclusive parties, became a multi-purpose hall equipped with tables, chairs, and a small stage for events. Every room was given a new purpose: offices for social workers, classrooms for skill-building workshops, and even a cozy library stocked with donated books. James made sure the process involved the entire neighborhood. Volunteers came forward in droves, eager to contribute their time and skills. Some painted walls, while others cleaned windows or helped organize furniture. Children pitched in too, planting flowers in the garden and hanging handmade decorations. The sense of ownership grew stronger with each passing day. People weren't just helping James, they were building something for themselves, their families, and future generations. When the community center officially opened its doors, the turnout was overwhelming. Hundreds of residents gathered outside, cheering as James cut the ribbon. Inside, they explored the various rooms, marveling at how the once intimidating mansion had been transformed into a space full of warmth and possibility. A group of veterans sat together in one corner, sharing stories over coffee. Nearby, children played board games under the watchful eyes of volunteers. In another room, adults attended a workshop on budgeting and saving money. It was clear that this place would serve as more than just a building. It would be the heart of the neighborhood. Richard, meanwhile, had moved away, unable to bear staying in the area he once dominated. He rented a modest apartment on the outskirts of town, far from the life he used to lead. At first, he tried to maintain his usual arrogance, pretending nothing had changed. But deep down, he felt hollow. His wealth was gone, his reputation tarnished, and his isolation complete. Friends he thought were loyal avoided him, unwilling to associate with someone who had fallen so far. Even his family kept their distance, tired of his bitterness and refusal to accept responsibility for his actions. One evening, sitting alone in his barren apartment, Richard found himself reflecting on everything that had happened. Memories of his encounters with James replayed in his mind: their initial meeting in the park, the failed attempts to discredit him, and finally, the sale of the mansion. For the first time, Richard allowed himself to consider the possibility that he might have been wrong about James. Perhaps wealth wasn't the only measure of success. Perhaps there was value in the things James had prioritized: kindness, humility, and service to others. Determined to make amends, Richard decided to visit the neighborhood he had left behind. He arrived early one morning, parking his car a few blocks away to avoid drawing attention. As he walked through the streets, he noticed how much had changed. The houses were well maintained, the gardens lush and colorful. Neighbors greeted each other warmly, stopping to chat or share jokes. Laughter echoed from the park, where children played on swings and parents relaxed on benches. It was a stark contrast to the cold, disconnected atmosphere Richard remembered. When he reached the community center, Richard hesitated outside, unsure if he should go in. Finally, summoning his courage, he stepped through the doors. Inside, he was greeted by the hum of activity, people chatting, working, and learning. No one recognized him at first, which gave him a moment to observe unnoticed. Veterans discussed job opportunities in one room, while teenagers practiced coding in another. A group of women sewed quilts for charity, their needles moving rhythmically, as they laughed and shared stories. Eventually, James spotted Richard standing near the entrance. For a brief moment, neither man said anything. Then James approached, his expression calm, but guarded. "Richard," he said simply, nodding in acknowledgement. Richard swallowed hard, feeling a mix of shame and regret. "James," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to see what you've done here." James gestured for Richard to follow him, leading him on a tour of the center. As they walked, James explained the various programs and initiatives, highlighting the impact they'd had on the community. He introduced Richard to some of the people using the facilities: a single mother taking classes to earn her GED, a retired teacher volunteering as a tutor, and a young man interning at a local business thanks to connections made at the center. Each story emphasized the power of collaboration and support. By the end of the tour, Richard was visibly moved. "I don't know how to say this," he began haltingly, "but I owe you an apology. I treated you badly, dismissed your efforts, and looked down on you because of my own arrogance. I see now how wrong I was." James listened quietly, his expression thoughtful. When Richard finished speaking, James extended his hand. "Apology accepted," he said firmly. "But remember, it's not me you need to make things right with. It's the community." Those words stuck with Richard long after he left the center. Over the following weeks, he began reaching out to former neighbors, offering sincere apologies, and asking how he could help. Some were skeptical at first, but Richard's persistence eventually won them over. He started volunteering at the community center, assisting with maintenance tasks and organizing fundraising events. Slowly but surely, he began rebuilding trust, not as the wealthy businessman he once was, but as someone willing to learn and grow. The neighborhood continued to thrive under James's leadership. New programs were introduced, including art classes, fitness sessions, and mentorship opportunities for young people. Families who had struggled to survive now dreamed of brighter futures, knowing they had a strong support system behind them. And though Richard's journey toward redemption was far from over, his presence served as a reminder that change was possible, even for those who seemed beyond hope. Through it all, James remained steadfast in his mission. He never sought recognition or praise. Instead, he focused on creating a better world for those around him. His actions inspired others to do the same, proving that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in the lives touched and transformed. The neighborhood had become a testament to the power of compassion, unity, and resilience, a legacy James Harper would leave behind for generations to come. As months passed, the neighborhood continued to flourish under James Harper's guidance. The community center became a hub of activity, buzzing with energy from morning until night. Families gathered there for meals, students studied in the library, and workshops taught everything from cooking to computer skills. What started as a simple idea had grown into something much bigger, a place where people found not just resources but also hope and belonging. James worked tirelessly to ensure the center met everyone's needs, always listening to feedback and making improvements. One of the most popular additions was the Neighbor Helping Neighbor program. This initiative encouraged residents to share their talents and skills with one another. A retired carpenter offered free lessons on basic home repairs, while a former teacher organized tutoring sessions for children struggling in school. Even Richard Caldwell joined in, using his business knowledge to mentor young entrepreneurs. Though he still felt out of place at times, Richard found purpose in these small acts of service. For the first time in years, he felt like he belonged somewhere. The sense of unity spread beyond the community center. Neighbors looked out for each other, forming bonds that went deeper than casual friendships. When Maria Gonzalez's car broke down, 3 different families offered rides to her kids' school. When Mrs. Thompson fell ill, volunteers took turns delivering meals and checking on her. These acts of kindness weren't planned or forced. They came naturally, born from the trust and connection James had nurtured. Despite all the progress, challenges still arose. One winter, a severe storm swept through the area, knocking out power and damaging several homes. Trees fell across roads, blocking access to essential services, and icy winds left many without heat. But instead of panicking, the community sprang into action. James coordinated efforts to clear debris and distribute blankets, flashlights, and food stored at the community center. Volunteers worked around the clock, ensuring no one was left behind. During this crisis, Richard proved himself invaluable. Using his experience managing large projects, he helped organize cleanup crews and secure supplies from nearby towns. His leadership during the storm earned him newfound respect from neighbors who had once doubted his sincerity. After days of hard work, the power was restored, and life slowly returned to normal. However, the storm had strengthened the bonds between residents, reminding them of the importance of working together. Spring arrived, bringing warmer weather and new opportunities. James decided to host a neighborhood festival to celebrate how far they'd come. Stalls were set up in the park, selling homemade crafts, baked goods, and fresh produce from the communal garden. Local musicians performed on a makeshift stage, filling the air with lively tunes. Children ran around with balloons, while adults enjoyed barbecued food and laughter-filled conversations. It was a day of joy and gratitude, a testament to what the community had built together. At the festival, Richard stood quietly off to the side, watching the festivities unfold. He couldn't help but compare this vibrant scene to the lonely existence he had led before. Here, surrounded by smiling faces and shared happiness, he realized how empty his life had been when it revolved only around wealth and status. As if, sensing his thoughts, James approached him. "You've come a long way," James said with a warm smile. "I'm proud of you." Richard nodded, feeling a lump rise in his throat. "I couldn't have done it without your example," he admitted. "You showed me what really matters." James placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's not about me. It's about all of us. We're stronger together." The festival ended, with a special ceremony honoring those who had contributed to the community's success. James gave a short speech thanking everyone for their hard work and dedication. Then, to everyone's surprise, Richard stepped forward to speak. His voice trembled at first, but he soon found his rhythm. "I used to think I was better than everyone else because I had money," he confessed. "But I was wrong. True strength comes from caring for others and lifting them up. Thank you for teaching me that." His words were met with applause, not out of pity but out of genuine appreciation for his growth. Many people shook his hand afterward, welcoming him fully into the fold. That moment marked a turning point, not just for Richard but for the entire neighborhood. Forgiveness and understanding had replaced judgment and division. Life moved on, and so did the community. New families moved in, drawn by the neighborhood's reputation for kindness and cooperation. They quickly became part of the fabric, contributing their own unique talents and perspectives. James continued overseeing the properties and the community center, always looking for ways to improve. He introduced programs to teach sustainable living practices, such as composting and rainwater harvesting, encouraging residents to care for the environment alongside each other. Even as the neighborhood expanded, its core values remained unchanged. People prioritized relationships over material possessions, empathy over arrogance, and teamwork over individualism. Children grew up learning these principles, carrying them into adulthood and passing them on to future generations. The ripple effect of James's vision extended far beyond the boundaries of the neighborhood, inspiring similar initiatives in nearby areas. For Richard, the journey wasn't easy, but it was rewarding. He learned to live modestly, finding contentment in simplicity rather than excess. Volunteering at the community center gave him a renewed sense of purpose, and the friendships he formed filled the void left by his old life. Though he would never forget the mistakes he made, he embraced them as lessons that shaped him into a better person. As time went on, James's health began to decline. Years of hard work and stress had taken their toll, leaving him weaker than he cared to admit. Still, he refused to slow down, determined to see the community thrive for as long as possible. Neighbors noticed his fatigue and insisted he take breaks, often stepping in to handle tasks he usually managed himself. Their support reminded James that he wasn't alone, that the community he had built would endure long after he was gone. On a quiet summer evening, James sat on the porch of his small house, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Max, his loyal dog, lay at his feet snoozing peacefully. Across the street, children played tag, their laughter echoing through the air. Nearby, couples strolled hand in hand, enjoying the cool breeze. It was a perfect moment, one that embodied everything James had worked for. Though James knew his time was limited, he felt no sadness, only peace. He had accomplished what he set out to do, create a place where people could live with dignity, support each other, and find happiness. The neighborhood wasn't perfect, but it was alive with love and resilience, qualities that would sustain it through whatever challenges lay ahead. And as James closed his eyes, listening to the sounds of the community he loved, he smiled, knowing his legacy would live on. The passing of James Harper left a deep void in the neighborhood, but his spirit lived on in every corner of the community he had built. When news of his death spread, people gathered at the community center to honor his memory. The multi-purpose hall, once Richard Caldwell's grand ballroom, was filled with neighbors sharing stories about how James had touched their lives. Some spoke of his kindness during tough times, while others recalled his unwavering determination to help those in need. Tears flowed freely, but so did laughter as everyone celebrated the man who had brought them together. Maria Gonzalez stood up to share her story, her voice trembling with emotion. "When I first came here, I didn't know if I could make it," she said, clutching her youngest child's hand. "But James believed in me. He gave us a home when no one else would. Because of him, my kids have a future." Her words resonated deeply with the crowd, many of whom nodded in agreement. Others followed, recounting moments of encouragement or support they had received from James. By the end of the gathering, it was clear that James wasn't just a person, he was the foundation upon which the entire community stood. In the days that followed, residents came together to ensure James's legacy endured. They formed a committee to oversee the properties and the community center, ensuring everything ran smoothly without him. Each member brought unique skills to the table. Some handled finances, others organized events, and a few took charge of maintenance. Even Richard stepped up, using his experience to manage logistics and negotiate contracts. Though he still struggled with self-doubt, he found strength in knowing that his contributions honored James's memory. To keep James's vision alive, the committee introduced new initiatives inspired by his values. One project focused on teaching financial literacy to teenagers, helping them save for college or start small businesses. Another encouraged sustainable practices, such as planting more trees and reducing waste. These efforts not only strengthened the community, but also attracted attention from outside organizations eager to partner with them. Grants and donations poured in, allowing the neighborhood to expand its reach and impact even further. As the years went by, the neighborhood became a model for others seeking to create similar communities. Visitors traveled from nearby towns and cities to learn how James had transformed an ordinary suburb into a beacon of hope and unity. Schools invited former residents to speak about their experiences, inspiring students to think beyond themselves and consider ways to give back. The communal garden, now larger and more vibrant than ever, became a symbol of collaboration and growth, producing enough food to feed dozens of families. Richard Caldwell, too, continued to grow. He had come a long way from the arrogant businessman who once ridiculed James Harper. Now he spent his days mentoring young entrepreneurs and volunteering at the community center he once owned. His transformation amazed those who had known him in the past, proving that change was possible no matter how entrenched someone's habits might seem. Richard often reflected on how much he owed to James, not just for showing him the error of his ways, but also for giving him a second chance. One day, Richard decided to write a letter to James, though he knew it could never be delivered. Sitting at his desk, pen in hand, he poured out his thoughts. "Dear James, I wish I could tell you how sorry I am for the way I treated you. You saw value in me when I couldn't see it myself. Thanks to you, I've learned what it means to truly live. Not for wealth or status, but for others. This neighborhood is your masterpiece, and I promise to protect it as if it were my own. Thank you for believing in me, even when I didn't deserve it." Though the letter remained tucked away in a drawer, its words stayed etched in Richard's mind, guiding his actions every day. He became a bridge between the old guard, the original tenants, and newcomers eager to join the thriving community. Together, they ensured that James's principles of compassion, humility, and service remained at the forefront of everything they did. Children grew up hearing stories about James Harper, the veteran who turned ridicule into redemption. Teachers used his example to teach lessons about perseverance and empathy, encouraging students to follow in his footsteps. Murals depicting his likeness appeared throughout the neighborhood, alongside quotes reminding everyone of the power of kindness. The communal garden even featured a special section dedicated to him, where flowers bloomed year-round in his honor. Decades later, the neighborhood remained a testament to James's vision. Families passed down stories of his generosity, ensuring that future generations understood the importance of community. New challenges arose, of course: economic downturns, natural disasters, and shifts in demographics. But the bonds forged under James's leadership held firm. People leaned on each other just as they always had, finding strength in unity. Richard, now an elderly man, spent his final years surrounded by the very people he had once looked down upon. They cared for him as he aged, ensuring he lacked nothing. On his last birthday, the entire neighborhood threw him a party at the community center. Children sang songs, adults shared memories, and everyone thanked him for the role he played in carrying forward James's work. As Richard blew out the candles on his cake, tears glistened in his eyes. He had finally found the family he never knew he needed. When Richard passed away, he was buried next to James in a quiet cemetery overlooking the neighborhood. A simple plaque marked his grave, inscribed with the words, "A man redeemed by love who found purpose in serving others." Together, their resting places served as a reminder of the extraordinary journey two men had taken, one starting with ridicule and arrogance, the other with kindness and humility, and how both had ultimately shaped a better world. Today, the neighborhood stands as a living tribute to James Harper and the ideals he championed. It is a place where laughter echoes through the streets, where strangers become friends, and where everyone works together to lift each other up. Though James and Richard are gone, their legacies endure, woven into the fabric of a community that continues to thrive because of their combined efforts. And in the hearts of all who call this place home, the belief remains strong. True wealth lies not in possessions, but in the connections we forge and the lives we touch.